Welcome back to the Off Peak, a video series from Charged Fleet covering all electric fleets. I'm editor and Off Peak host Martin Ramju. Our guest in this episode is Steve Greenfield, the founder and CEO of Automotive Ventures and author of the recently released book, The Future of Automotive Retail. Greenfield foresees a coming shakeup in how the automotive industry will transact vehicles as electric vehicles gain market share and bring a unique set of requirements and traits. What does this mean for fleet customers, dealers, and auctions? Well, we now get some insights from Steve. All right, Steve Greenfield, thanks for joining us here on the Off Peak. Great to have you.
Martin, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to get into elaborate on some of the points from your recent book, The Future of Automotive Retail. And I wanted to start off on something you have certainly mentioned in presentations, and that is what auctions are facing as they have to adapt to selling and reselling EVs. What are the dimensions of this transition, and how is it shaping up?
The auctions have another host of issues, right? One is, how do they represent to a bidding dealer that the remaining battery life is strong? Because right now there is not a Carfax for EVs. So there's some of the auction companies are working on their own technologies. There are other technologies out there that hopefully emerge as well. I think that charging infrastructure, same thing. If I've got a fleet of EVs that come off fleet, and it used to be when I worked in the auction industry, we'd always leave every car with a gallon or two of gas, but that was it. It was up to the buying dealer to make sure there was enough gas in the car to get it home. Now, what are they going to do? Because the last thing you want is like when some fleet operator at the auction levels, runs out of charge, how are they going to be able to bring charge to the vehicle? So they're going to have to invest in charging infrastructure, physical charging infrastructure, but also remote chargers to be able to run around to these vehicles overall. And then, the last thing is safety issues. So these things have high voltage. People could get electrocuted. And if there isn't knowledge of the technician in terms of that specific vehicle, that brand, and they may not have the tools that are appropriate to work on that brand, there's a safety issue just working on the vehicle. So you need a certain level of technician sophistication and tool availability. But then, when these vehicles, the battery packs get damaged, as we see in the press, they do sometimes spontaneously combust. So if you're decommissioning EVs, you have to make sure, one, they've got the charge entirely out of them. And I understand there's some technology out there that's being worked on to literally dunk the batteries in a saline solution to make sure all the charge has been discharged. And then you need to be able to, park these batteries at a distance, housed in some kind of fire-resistant housing, and enough of a distance that if there is a fire and these things catch fire, that you don't suddenly, catch a lot of working vehicles, be it ICE vehicles or not, on fire. So there's going to have to be like decommissioning, thoughts around decommissioning these things, whether it's a salvage property or just, a vehicle that you find out that the battery needs to be decommissioned. So maybe more information than you asked for, but I guess my takeaway would be looking at both sides, the dealer side and the auction side, a whole slew of new facets that they have to deal with that they haven't up until now had to worry about.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you mention the incentives. As we know, incentives are kind of at an all-time low given the supply chain pressures and availability of vehicles. But of course, fleets often buy vehicles in bulk, and they count on discounts or bulk rates when it comes to vehicles. But with EVs and how they're shaping up with demand, what can fleets expect in terms of any pricing flexibility?
In the short term, none. In the midterm, probably not a lot. I mean, the answer is similar to, how's the dust going to settle overall on the consumer? And again, I may have a contrarian point of view, but I think that the temptation is going to be too high take any of the mainstream brands, not to overproduce vehicles to satisfy what is now this gaping hole of demand by the fleets, right? So we know that either on the commercial side or the rental car side, we have millions of vehicles that weren't produced. almost every single one of them will probably sell at MSRP into fleets with no discounting. And I think, coming out of that, we're going to find this temptation for the legacy OEMs to overproduce vehicles. So I think long term, that will mean we'll get back to an environment where there are juicy incentives, especially if you're not too fixated on buying one specific make or model. I think we'll get back to an environment, 2 years from now, where we'll see more normalized incentive activity and you'll be able to get deep discounts. But I think between now and 18 months from now, I wouldn't expect, as we're refleeting, that there's going to be much discounts at all, just because we have so much pent up demand out there needed to be filled.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that kind of a projection for incentives and discounts, obviously fleets at some point are going to be remarketing their first wave of EVs. Based on what you've seen so far, how confident can we be that the future wholesale used EV market will be as profitable as the ICE one?
It's a great question, and I think nobody can really peer into the crystal ball right now. I would not want to be one of these companies that's setting residual values, because as we saw recently, it wasn't lost on me, like 2 months ago, Ford announced that for retail leases, the consumers would no longer have an option of buying the vehicle back at the end of their lease term. Oh, that's pretty interesting. And I haven't heard any other OEM follow suit. Now, Ford, the headline was that Ford was trying to protect against, reclaiming the battery constituents, right? The raw materials, in case they wanted to get independence around the supply chain. I think it's the likely truth is there's uncertainty around what residual values are going to be. And, if they have the option of reabsorbing all of those vehicles, because I mean, how are things going to play out? To address your question, we do run the risk that there's breakthroughs in battery technology. And suddenly the batteries either can get charged within 5 minutes, which greatly mitigates people's concerns around range anxiety, or conversely, we find that the batteries can hold a capacity of 1,000-mile range or more. Either way, we're going to find, like, the earlier generation 1 of these EVs might not be worth nearly as much. And we saw some of this. The greatest analog we have is like with the Nissan Leaf. They overleased that vehicle. By the time they came back, the battery condition meant that you maybe had like a 60 or 70-mile range in many cases, and they just weren't worth a lot at that point. And I think every manufacturer has to be really sensitive that at the end of a 2, 3, or 4 year lease period, what is the value going to be? And I think, like I said earlier, we need to be concerned around how to represent battery condition, and that should be some equivalent of a Carfax for EVs. But there may be leapfrogs in battery technology, which means the generation 1 of these EVs may not be worth a lot, and it may really hit residual values as a result.
So this means fleets really need to be careful with their financial and cost projections, because potentially in this market they could be paying MSRP or above for an electric fleet vehicle, and then 3 to 4 years from now, the batteries will have leapfrogged and they're stuck with a car that's not worth much.
Yeah, so I think it's, to your point, I would kind of characterize it as a potential double whammy, worst case scenario, which is, even if you bought an ICE vehicle right now and paid full MSRP, at some point 2 years from now, that vehicle will get back to regular depreciation rates. And so we're going to find a lot of folks who bought vehicles at MSRP 2 or 3 years from now have tremendous negative equity in the vehicle. That's what I'm saying. I empathize with folks trying to set residual values right now. And then, the second part, the second part of the double whammy could be with EVs, and the depreciation schedules might be even more aggressive based on what new battery technologies is out. So I would say proceed with caution, be very sensitive to what those residual values are, and, operate under the assumption that you might find, more accelerated depreciation than maybe people are talking about right now, and make sure you don't have a big balance sheet issue in 2 or 3 years down the road.
Now, can any of this be mitigated at all with the typical life cycle or turnover rates for EVs as they are in fleets? Because we keep hearing how EVs have fewer moving parts, they require less maintenance. Would it make sense for a fleet to keep a vehicle for 8 to 10 years versus 2 to 4? What's the potential there?
Yes, yeah, I think so. I mean, you said it very eloquently. I've seen diagrams that show the average ICE vehicle has 2,000 moving parts in its drivetrain, whereas the average EV has 20. They don't need oil changes, they don't need spark plugs. The only thing that I believe that they're going to need more frequently are tires, because they are heavier than the equivalent ICE vehicle and have more torque. So someone with a lead foot, so to speak, is going to burn through tires more frequently. But that can all be accommodated quite easily as a fleet owner. So yeah, the actual lifespan of these things, if they're maintained, should be a lot longer, all predicated obviously on battery condition. But I think that that's one way to mitigate. So I would almost look at it as a barbell. One strategy would be just to plan on defleeting these things at an accelerated rate, knowing that new technology might come out and mitigating. But the other might be hold on to them as long as possible and keep them in good stead, good condition, and try not to defleet them, and just basically assume that you're going to amortize the entire vehicle's value over the term of that longer term hold time.
Mm-hmm. There was another interesting component to this that you touched upon in the book, and that was energy resources and the power grid. And a lot of us were shocked out here in California when we were told not to charge electric vehicles because of the heat wave. What do you foresee as the upgrades and the resources that will be needed to accommodate the spike in EV usage across the U.S.? How much of it can be handled through additional resources versus intelligent arbitrage that can pick smart times? What do you foresee as being the right balance here?
Yeah, so I mean, at first blush, it seems pretty dire, right? Especially when you hear some of the stories out in California where you are, in terms of already the draw on the grid in hot months, and then you're going to have all these EVs plugged in as well. I think I'm hopeful for the mitigators, one of which, as you mentioned, is like software that may give financial incentives for people to charge at certain hours, and at least give consumers the transparency. Hey, try not to have your car plugged in between 5 and 7 at night, or whatever the peak hours are for charging. Ideally, you would also layer in a financial incentive to the consumer. I think I'm more excited. There's been more articles recently around the vehicle to grid opportunity, and whether these vehicles are effectively a mitigating storage of capacity that you might actually pay consumers to keep their vehicle plugged into the grid, and you're going to draw power down from the vehicle to charge your neighbors, so kind of like a daisy chain, right? So, but all of that's going to take new innovative companies and a lot of creativity and open-mindedness, because it isn't going to be a very one-way transaction where we all plug in our cars, draw down power from an existing grid. I just don't think we're going to have the capacity for that. But I think that this combination of software and incentives, coupled with vehicles that can actually put power back into the grid, should be able to mitigate a lot of that. And I think that so I'm hopeful, fingers crossed.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that's keeps coming up is the example that Tesla has set for EVs. It seems as if they're hitting all the right buttons early on, as you referenced earlier. What do you think the manufacturers of electric vans, pickup trucks, work trucks, many of these present and future vehicles that will be heading into fleets, what can they learn from the Tesla model of doing business and maintaining and keeping these vehicles running?
I think we are conditioning consumers of passenger vehicles or commercial fleet of just convenience. And the nice thing about convenience, it cuts both ways, right? So the example I use is like, I am one of the 167 million Amazon Prime customers in the US. And I know that I am paying a premium, literally through membership, but also paying a premium because Amazon doesn't make it easy for someone like me to price compare. But I'm willing to give up the ability to get the lowest price based on the fact that I can get delivery next day with a good return policy. And I think that that's very deliberate. And I think that probably we're going to find that the next generation of consumers are a lot less price sensitive, which may play directly into what we've discussed around OEMs intending to sell every car at MSRP. but there may not be a lot of negotiation in the future for vehicles if the process of buying and owning is very, very convenient. So we'll see how that plays out. I think a lot of the OEMs are betting on that. And I think from a commercial standpoint, it may manifest itself in one, not a lot of discounts when you're actually buying vehicles to put into fleet, but there may be more profitability because the actual end user is a lot less price sensitive and a lot less prone to kind of grinding the fleet management companies on price. So we'll see how all that plays out, but it gives me hope that there may be more profit potential in a transaction in the future if we're able to provide much more convenience to the end user as a result.
Mm-hmm. Well, Steve, there's so much more we could talk about with this, but we'll definitely have to have you back. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thanks. It's always a pleasure, and thanks for making time for me today, Martin.
A special thank you to Steve Greenfield for some visionary insights on how EVs will change automotive market dynamics. You can find his recent book, The Future of Automotive Retail, on Amazon.com and AutomotiveVentures.com. Remember to follow and connect with us on social media, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and sign up for our weekly Charged Fleet e-newsletter to stay up to date on the latest EV industry news. I'm Martin Romju with Charged Fleet. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again here on another electrified episode of The Off Peak.